Picture dinosaurs out here. Wind screaming, snow blinding, nothing but tundra. Not a jungle, not even close. For decades, we imagined dinosaurs as warm-weather giants, so why are we standing in the Arctic cold? In winter, the far north can sink into darkness for weeks, sometimes months, while the world keeps moving without sunlight. And yet, in frozen ground like this, researchers have uncovered fossil bones, quiet, stubborn evidence that shouldn't exist here. Meet the people who dig through ice-cold sediment, one careful brushstroke at a time, chasing a story buried in stone. These remote camps sit at extreme latitudes where every tool freezes, every step fights wind, and daylight can vanish fast. The cliffs and river cuts expose ancient layers like a timeline, each band a chapter from a world we barely recognize. Here's the hook. The most unsettling clue isn't a giant skeleton, it's the tiny fossils, small bodies, big questions. So before we ask how dinosaurs survived, we have to prove they truly lived here and what that Arctic life demanded. When we say the Arctic, we mean the far top of the world, where maps curve and seasons don't behave normally. This is Alaska's North Slope, wide, quiet tundra that feels endless, even before the cold really tightens. Up here, daylight can shrink fast. The sun skims the horizon, then slips away, leaving long stretches of dim. So imagine living through cold, dark seasons with wind, frost, and a landscape that can feel empty overnight. Many locals know this land intimately, reading rivers, bluffs, and weather like a language, because survival depends on it. And those river cuts? They're nature's open book, exposing ancient layers that once held a completely different world. One of the key sites is often described as the Prince Creek Formation, high-latitude ground where dinosaur fossils appear. But here's the problem. Tundra plants are tough and seasonal. If you're a giant herbivore, what happens when light disappears? What scientists pulled from this soil doesn't look like a vacation herd, it looks like a home.
At first, this landscape feels empty, just wind and tundra. But the ground here hides stories no one expected. Researchers walk these eroding bluffs like detectives, scanning for anything that breaks the pattern of rock and gravel. Sometimes it's a tiny texture in a stone, just enough to make your hand stop and your heart speed up. Every find gets logged, carefully, because one isolated bone is a curiosity, but patterns can change history. The cliffs reveal sediment layers like chapters, and fossils often show up in specific bands, not scattered everywhere. That's why teams grid the ground and work slowly, because the weirdness isn't just a bone, it's concentration. When you screen sediment, you don't find one piece, you find many. Chips, fragments, clues that pile up together. And that's when the story shifts from a lost traveler to what looks like an entire dinosaur community. Then comes something sharper, a tooth edge with tiny serrations hinting a predator once hunted in this far north. And beside it, different bone textures appear, often linked to plant eaters, suggesting a full food web, not a single guest. Even the plants here feel like part of the mystery, seasonal, tough, and fragile under darkness and cold. Many locals know where erosion speaks loudest, guiding researchers to bluffs that reveal the past without forcing it. When larger pieces appear, they're stabilized and protected, because you're not just collecting fossils, you're saving context. And the growing number of finds raises the real question: are we seeing visitors or residents? Between storms, the camp goes quiet, and in that silence, you can almost feel how hard this place is. Back at the table, tiny fossils are cleaned grain by grain, patient work that turns maybe into something real. Some researchers suggest herds could have moved together, using numbers and behavior to survive long, brutal seasons.
But the tundra doesn't keep evidence for long. One season of erosion and the landscape changes again. Still, the fossils often appear from the same layers, like a repeated signature, insisting this wasn't a one-time event. And the next clue goes even further, because it points to something wild, not just survival, but parenthood. The Arctic can look gentle at sunrise, until you remember how quickly this light can disappear for the season. Inside the tent, the work is slow and human, sorting grains of sediment hour after hour, hoping for something rare. Most finds aren't dramatic. They're tiny fragments, so small you could miss them with one careless shake. That's why microscopes matter out here. Under the lens, a speck can become a clue with a whole story. Some researchers suggest a few of these delicate pieces may come from juveniles, young animals, not fully grown adults. And the search isn't just science. Local knowledge guides where erosion reveals the past without forcing the land. Every promising spot gets marked and measured because context matters as much as the fossil itself. Sometimes the bluff opens like a window, and you realize the ground is constantly rewriting what it chooses to show. Now the mystery sharpens. If young dinosaurs were here, some kind of nesting may have happened at high latitudes. Side by side, the sizes don't match. Smaller fragments hint at younger bodies, evidence that's harder to explain away. Field life is quiet courage, warm meals, shared jokes, and teamwork, because the environment never stops pushing back. Everything is routine and care. Thawing water, padding samples, because one mistake can erase weeks of work. And here's the chilling thought. If babies were born here, then someone had to survive the full Arctic winter. In dim light, staying close becomes a strategy. Small bodies follow larger ones, and every step is protection. So if they weren't just passing through, then the real question hits harder. How do you keep giants alive in darkness? So how do you keep a giant body alive in darkness and cold? Researchers circle four main hypotheses, still debated. First, some scientists suggest certain dinosaurs managed heat better than we assumed, more active, more resilient, maybe higher metabolism. Cold isn't just temperature, it's stress, wind, frost, and time. Every hour outside burns energy even before you move. If metabolism helped, it wasn't magic. It was a steady engine, enough to function when the landscape punished mistakes. Bones can hold subtle clues, but they don't give easy answers. Patterns hint at physiology, yet interpretation stays cautious. Second, insulation. Many researchers argue feather-like coverings or fuzz could reduce heat loss, especially for smaller bodies. But here's the twist. If babies were here, insulation alone won't explain the hardest part, the long Arctic winter. Third, behavior. Even today, shelter changes everything. A ridge, a windbreak, a hollow, small choices, big survival. The Arctic isn't one flat stage. Microclimates exist. A protected valley can be calmer, warmer, and safer than open tundra. In herds, bodies become tools, blocking wind, sharing roots, staying close. Cooperation can be as important as strength. But behavior is tricky to prove from fossils. Sometimes we infer it carefully, using landscapes and modern patterns as hints. Fourth, migration. Some researchers suggest seasonal movement following food and light could help, at least for some groups. And then the baby evidence complicates everything. If young animals were present, long-distance migration becomes harder to explain. That's why this story refuses to be simple. Each answer opens another question, and the Arctic keeps its secrets. To imagine solutions, we look at living survivors. Caribou travel far, timing their lives around seasons and scarcity. Muskox face the wind and endure, using insulation and behavior. Different strategies, same message. Cold demands adaptation. And birds thrive in extremes too, showing how evolution can repeat useful ideas in totally different lineages. That's convergent evolution, not family ties, but similar solutions, insulation, movement, teamwork, when nature sets the same trap. Food is the real clock. In winter, plants fade, and herbivores must find enough to keep the engine running. Survival becomes an energy budget, what you spend to move, to warm up, to eat, to protect the young. One more twist, if the world goes dark, the problem isn't just cold, it's what disappears with sunlight. So we pause, because the best documentaries oversimplify this. The truth is messy, human, and still unfolding. Even experts argue over what mattered most: heat, insulation, behavior, migration, or a mix that changed by species. Seasons could flip fast, greener summers, harsher winters, making the Arctic a swinging door between abundance and punishment. And that leads to the next shock. The Arctic back then wasn't what you think, and that changes everything. Let's do a reset, myth versus reality, because the Arctic dinosaur story gets exaggerated in both directions. Myth 1, dinosaurs only belonged in tropical jungles. Reality is messier. They lived across many habitats and latitudes. In some places, conditions were greener than you'd imagine, with rivers and forests supporting large animals for long stretches. But high latitude is still high latitude. Even in milder eras, the north comes with darkness, wind, and seasonal stress. And that matters for our title. Global freezing is cinematic language, not a guarantee of a modern-style ice age. Reality, the strongest evidence points to harsh polar seasons, long, dim winters, shifting food, and a sky that can vanish. So no, it wasn't always a frozen wasteland like today. Some seasons could look surprisingly alive and green. But then the switch flips. Winter arrives, light collapses, and the same land becomes a different world overnight. That's why researchers keep saying, don't oversimplify. Warmish doesn't mean easy. Seasonal extremes still hit hard. Even a tough herd would feel it, finding enough food, keeping warm, protecting young, and avoiding danger in low light. Here's the key twist. An Arctic that isn't always icy can still be lethal, because darkness breaks the rules. The cold isn't just cold, it's wind, frost, and exhaustion, tiny costs that add up hour after hour. So myth versus reality lands here. Survival wasn't one superpower, it was constant trade-offs under a brutal calendar. And that brings us to the price. What did life up there cost, and who didn't make it through?
This is the price of the North. Beauty, silence, and a calendar that can turn life off like a switch. When the sun disappears, it's not just darker, it's colder, longer, and harder to find anything that keeps you alive. Plants freeze into place, growth pauses, and a food web built on seasonal green can break at the weakest link. The valley goes quiet fast. No movement, no easy meals, just wind and distance, like the land is holding its breath. Some researchers suggest herds would have faced real scarcity, moving constantly, searching patches of food that shrink each week. And the Arctic erases evidence. Footprints vanish, trails disappear, and storms rewrite the ground before answers can form. That's why field notes matter, because fossils show presence, but they rarely explain the day-to-day strategy of survival. In trays like this, you can feel the gaps. Bones without behavior, fragments without the full story around them. Nights in camp remind you what animals endured. Wind, darkness, and energy loss that never stops ticking. For juveniles, the risk is even sharper. Small bodies lose heat faster, and one bad week could mean everything. Scientists still debate the details. How cold it got, who migrated, who stayed, and which hypothesis fits best. So you're left weighing competing ideas, behavior, insulation, migration, knowing reality might be a mix, not one answer. And still, the fossils keep whispering the same impossible message. Dinosaurs didn't just visit, they endured. What we don't find is part of the story too. Missing layers, missing seasons, missing moments the ground never preserved.
And that sets up the final question. If life adapted up here, what does that change about Earth's history itself? Standing here, it's hard not to feel it. The Arctic doesn't reward comfort, it rewards adaptation again and again. Packing these fossils, you realize the discovery isn't just dinosaurs up north, it's how much we misjudged survival. A tiny fragment can flip a whole story because it forces us to imagine life under darkness, wind, and scarcity. Some researchers suggest whole communities endured these seasons, not as visitors, but as residents of an extreme world. And that changes the past. Climate doesn't just shape landscapes, it shapes bodies, behaviors, and the limits of what life can do. Modern animals echo that lesson. Caribou keep moving, timing their lives to seasons that still feel unforgiving. And birds show another path: insulation, mobility, teamwork. Different designs, similar answers to the same cold challenge. But here's what keeps this mystery alive. We still don't know exactly which strategy mattered most or for who. What we do know is this: the Arctic forces honesty. You either adjust or you disappear from the record. And looking up at this sky, it's impossible not to feel respect for the land and for the lives it tested. Now, I want to ask you something because your answer says a lot about how you see survival. If you had to bet, migration, warm bodies, insulation, or herd behavior, which one saved them and why? Because the real legacy here is resilience. Life doesn't just endure, it redraws its own boundaries when the world changes. If this story made you see Earth differently, subscribe to Strange Earth Diaries and drop your theory in the comments. If dinosaurs could make it through that darkness, what else have we underestimated? And what should we look at next?